We are more than belonging to a group of people. We are all different kinds of people. And if we all leave nationalism behind us, and instead try to...
There's a dirty secret that most historians know, but just let people keep thinking anyways. Nations are a 19th century invention.
The authoritarian mindset is one that just likes stripping rights from people. Leave authoritarians no one to strip rights from, and they start stripping them from each other. And yes, that's what the research says. The other outlet for this restless energy is war, invasion, colonization. Deport all the Mexicans, and then follow them into Mexico. Go seeking an other to define yourself against.
Every time the topic of nationalism arrives in a modern political context, our red lips' mouth starts watering with excitement. They are so eager to drop the phrase that nationalism is a modern concept that was invented in the 18th or 19th century. For them, it is a liberal ideology. If you are spared this argument, then they will ask you to draw a literal black and white border between what you consider your own people and the outgroup. Alternatively, they will just claim that your in-group is already mixed, and therefore the topic is trivial. You would expect someone who bases his ideology around nationalism to answer to these kinds of people quite easily, but I'm sad to say that this is not the case. Even the most pretentious fake intellectual among nationalist circles stumbles his way around vague answers when confronted. This is what this series is for, to explain basic concepts quickly and effectively, to set a foundation for the terminology I use in my videos, and to offer you people a deeper understanding of the terms you probably use. All these earlier mentioned attempts at refuting nationalism only really blossomed because the modern right is completely incapable of working with real political concepts instead of jumping on esoteric or vague appeals to populist paroles. To refute these people, all it takes is a structural explanation and genealogy of nationalism, and this is what I will portray in this video. Politics and therefore nationalism must be done from reality and history as its foundation, and then can the ideological decorations be added onto that. Therefore, before anything in politics, you need to conceptualize some form of state of nature that you build your politics upon. These are of course not absolute, but when looking at history, two premises can be recognized. All behavior consists or is rooted in humans' first drive is to secure their own material and biological needs. Some humans have the drive to want more than what is needed to survive. The idea of a structural approach to nationalism implies nothing more than that an identity is created out of differentiation from the opposition. An in-group defines identity by its negation to the outgroup. What is important to understand here is that we speak of actual identities and not regional trivialities like dances, some clothing, or minor rituals. Identities are part of power dynamics and the in-group self-interest, and therefore shouldn't be instantly equalized to the vague term of culture. Identities show themselves in history not because a housewife danced around a fire, but instead how these identities led to action inside a power structure. This can either be a joyful act, shown by the act of expansion, or by the act of defense. This can be shown on basically all historical identities. For example, Roman identity was first that they were not Samnites, then that they were not Etruscan, and this process kept expanding until a united Italic identity arose against the Celts and the Greeks. Italy united not because they are one naturally united people that was theologically ordained to come together, but because their negations are far minor to each other than to the Celts. The difference to an Etruscan toga and a Roman toga becomes bearable when you see a Lepontic Celt in his pants full of urine. This historical act is the basis of identity and can show itself in either a more joyful setting, a setting of finding your identity by your own expansion, for example the Romans and the Germans, or sometimes in a defensive scenario. The example of the Roman identity becoming a Latin identity and then an Italic identity would be such a joyful example. A defensive scenario would be the Irish, who united as a people by negating their identity against the Germanic Anglos out of a defensive necessity. The common argument against this explanation of identity construction is the ignoring of traditionalist symbols like classical clothing, dancing, and so on, but this misunderstands the important point that these are secondary products of the first existent power dynamic. Where would the Roman housewife be if Rome would have been burned to the ground? The establishment of existence and power comes first, then the establishment of culture that remains in history, and the collective being. Remains of history is the important part here. The only identity that exists is one that is remembered. Dancing does not leave a historical impact, becoming an empire does. This makes national identity, and therefore nationalism, a value for a specific use, a means to an end, and not as its own self-validating object. Nationalism is not good because it is the root of all existence, but because it is the representation of this historical act of negation, through struggles and victories. It is nothing more than a semantic change from the word tribalism. Tribes form because of the expansion of material conditions, or will to power if the word material scares you off. A nation, like everything else, is a mean to an end for the individual. This is not a criticism of nationalism. This proves its validity. The fact that this mean has been so persistent for so long and still in the current political is still needed. So if nationalism is only a mean to expand material conditions, then the question would be, why unite at all? Why not be a free individual and only work for yourself? Why not unite all of humanity? All these questions root from a libertarian, positive view of politics, but misunderstands that this process of negation is not autonomous. The political identification of friend and enemy gets created out of circumstance and is not avoidable. The term nation, anyway, is nothing more than a placeholder for a group that negates itself to an amount that they can still work together to defeat the outer collective, which they negate stronger towards than the in-group negations. So why not unite the entire world? Because resources and space is a zero-sum game. The will wants to work together with the smallest collective possible to get the most power projection, while trying to share this power projection with the smallest amount possible. So what's the point of constructing and understanding nationalism through this more structural view? It allows you to apply this on a historical and political level beyond vague terms and of course in your own ideology. With this view, you can also easily refute most common arguments against nationalism. The idea that history teachers and breadtubers constantly want to throw at you is the idea that nationalism is an ideology that developed only in the 18th and 19th century. This is of course inspired by the masses of unification and liberation movements that happened during that time, most famously Germany itself. They are describing a different ideology though, compared to what most modern nationalists refer to. Modern nationalists refer to an over-historical motion, which is simply the extension of tribalism, instead of two contemporary forms of that time, which were liberal nationalism and liberation nationalism. The Greeks freeing themselves from the Ottoman rule, which can still be described as our idea of nationalism, that can be analyzed structurally, is not a new thing at all. The process we see in Greece, we saw countless times in history before, even in Greece itself. The Hellenes unified with each other rather than with the Persians, so Hellenic nationalism and the fight for Greek independence, which is often used as an example for the era of nationalism, refutes their own point. It happened during the 18th century but didn't start there. The more generic example is of course Germany. And what a miserable example that is, compared to how often it is regurgitated that Germany didn't exist till 1871, or some smug history nerd correcting you when you call any German before 1871 German. I use Germany as an example, not because I am German, but because it represents the most obvious misunderstanding these people have. Germany, from the liberal historian's perspective, only became a nation in 1871, because only then did it have the statehood and constitution that a liberal requires to understand collectives. The fact that the HRE had the literal title of the German nation in it already in the 15th century seems to be ignored. The fact that Otto the Great in 964 put an anti-Slavic policy in place to quell unrest in the Brandenburg already implies that there is a main group of the collective that he's governing over. The idea that nations are a modern invention only works if you want to speak about modern nationalism or liberal nationalism. And saying that was an invention of the 18th century is also completely okay. The fundamental issue is that this quote-unquote invention of nationalism is used to first of all deny the over-historical presence of collectives fighting each other based on things like ethnicity, and the problem is, it's also then connected to 20th century ideologies. The nationalism that fascism or any non-liberal, even the USSR picked up, wasn't the liberal nationalism of 1848, but the over-historical nationalism that was an extension of tribalism. They conflate the terms and then use this conflation to construct an argument against nationalism, which is obviously ineffective. The fact that liberal nationalism is ineffective is another topic, but also important. Germany, even with the 1848 revolution, didn't unite state-wise until the war with the French broke out, and it was then founded from above. Nations like England have existed since 927, and Italy became unified, in identity at least, in 200 AD. Greek identity started in 450 BC, or when Philip II united them at least. Point being is that 1848 nationalism pretubers and liberals refer to is not the nationalism that any non-liberal ideology appeals to or should appeal to. The term that is often used in history departments for describing the forming of collectives, especially during the migration period in 400 AD, is the term of ethnogenesis. Ethnogenesis refers to the forming of ethnic identities. When you are in a lecture about that time, you will constantly hear how there was no German identity, but instead Saxon, Bavarian, Hessian, and so on and so on. They describe the forming of the German identity as something that didn't need to happen, that it wasn't some genetic theological destiny. And all in all, that is very much correct. What they don't understand is why this wasn't absolute, and that this in no way refutes what nationalist ideologies propose, or at least should propose. Yes, Germany was split up, so was England, Italy, and every other people. Every people were at one point split up, and technically they still are. It's not like there's some eternal end goal to any of this. But the fluidity of ethnogenesis proves the point of nationalists, that identity is constructed out of material necessity that is negated against another outgroup. Why did the Germans unite around Heinrich I? Because the Hungarians invaded. Why did the Latins unite? Because the Etruscans got annoying. The fact that nationalism is fluid is not an argument against nationalism, but for it. The ground of Germany wasn't some holy ground that had to be German, but the Germanics migrated down south and subjugated or kicked out the Celts. Same thing can be seen in the United States, if we want to use a modern example of ethnogenesis for once. The United States is this famous melting pot of Europeans. The nationalism is often called not real by tryharding current Europeans, but this misunderstands our own history and what American identity is. The negation against African Americans and Native Americans by the 19th century was strong enough that Europeans formed a collective white identity because they were more similar to each other than the negated outgroup. This is a more modern process, but still fundamentally the same process as happened in Germany in the 9th century. That Germany wasn't Germany in the early medieval times is not an epic dunk on nationalism, but an argument for nationalism, for the honest kind of it. The kind that was able to form nations to begin with and make them go beyond themselves. Another point they then throw into this discussion is the term of ethnic intermixing, and equalizing this intermixing of, example, Germanics and Slavs and Mediterraneans and Celts to, for example, modern day migrations. This point again misunderstands how power dynamics worked at that time. The only way you could make this point sensibly if you literally just looked at a migration picture and then thought this happened in the 21st century. In reality, nationalism is about the masses, it's about collectivizing people together, so we can be more productive together, and states are tools of pacifying identity conflicts. All identities are constructed out of this earlier described negation process. Class would be an obvious example that has nothing to do with ethnicity. The proletariat negated off the capitalists, and the state uses its power to pacify this conflict to sustain the collective. Same with ethnic identity. Strong class difference in the same collective breeds class conflict. So does strong ethnic conflict, or anything else. Therefore, it is about pacifying this difference on the level of how the masses behave. If someone looks completely different and talks completely different, there is a potential of a strong negation. In early medieval Central and Northern Europe, the people are not that aesthetically different, so therefore, if you change a person's language, history and culture and all other consequences that make someone something, that person can become something else. To explain this in reality, Germany is a useful example again. The northeast of Germany during the early medieval period was not Germanic, it was Slavic. So during the time of Otto the Great's anti-Slavic policies, he Christianized them, forced the German language on them, they had no written record of their history anyway, and bam, 3 generations later, they were Germans. To equalize this to Africans or Middle Easterners who represent a misses how early medieval politics worked to begin with. Was there intermixing with different populations in Europe? Yes, obviously there was. Was this peaceful? No, it absolutely wasn't. It was always subjugated intermixing. There was one group that was erased and another that was being integrated towards. Where are the Proto-Europeans now? Where are the Old Prussians? Where are the Picts and Lepontic Celts nowadays? If modern historians want to compare that to modern immigration, then they don't understand the field they are working with. The reason why Celts, Slavs and Germans were able to subjugate each other into their collectives, it is not an example against a core identity, but exactly for it. It means there is something these people were subjugated into. Nationalism is an absolutely massive topic, and there's no way I can get every niche and every argument into this video. But I think I achieved my goal. I laid the foundation for explaining nationalism from a sensible perspective, and that is my primary point. Nationalism is rational, it has a purpose, it's not some vague schizophrenic concept that you can only groom people into with aesthetics. I mentioned in the video that there is no end goal to nationalism, and some idiots might jump onto that, like that example from Innuendo Studios. But this just shows on what level these people operate on. They do LARPy end of the world politics. Technically yes, when one identity does a world conquest run, then nationalism is futile and will eat itself up. Considering though that geopolitics, resources and reality exist, something that especially anarchists are not aware of, this seems quite unfeasible. There is no end goal to nationalism. I openly admit this. There is no end goal to anything, and that's a thing that most modern philosophers probably would also agree on. But there is something way more important to nationalism. There's a fundamental cause below it. And if you want to understand the concept of fundamental causes, please go watch it and watch my Nietzsche video. Also shout out to Gupi and 100 Gecs who said that racists shouldn't listen to the music. Thanks for making the background music to my video. Yeah, subscribe to my channel. Bye.